We are conditioned to treat silence as a malfunction, a void that must be immediately filled to maintain the illusion of connection. You have likely spent years bridging gaps that were never yours to bridge, offering context where none was requested, and mistaking your own relentless availability for loyalty. It is not a flaw in your character. It is a flaw in your understanding of the mechanism. You were taught that to be valued, you must be present, responsive, and consistent. But the physics of social dynamics often operate in reverse. The more you lean in, the more you become part of the background noise. The more you adjust to accommodate others, the more invisible you become. True leverage is rarely found in what you say, but in the discomfort you are willing to tolerate without flinching. There is a precise, unsettling clarity that arrives only when you stop trying to fix the silence and start using it as a lens. When you finally stop moving, the world stops being a negotiation and starts revealing its true structure. This is not a theory, it is a process of elimination. That began the moment he decided to stop filling the void. He noticed the change without a single dramatic moment marking it. There was no argument, no visible fallout, no door slammed shut. The shift announced itself through small absences, a reply that arrived hours later than usual, a conversation that resumed without acknowledging his earlier message, invitations that still existed, technically, but arrived late enough to feel procedural rather than intentional. Nothing was obvious enough to challenge. That was what made it effective. At first, he filled the gaps automatically. He followed up. He clarified tone. He softened statements that didn't need softening. He added context where none was requested. Each action felt reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern he didn't recognize until it was already established. The more he adjusted, the more invisible he became. Attention did not return. It redistributed, quietly, without explanation or apology. He told himself it was temporary. People were busy. Priorities shifted. That was how he justified the delays. But the consistency of the absence contradicted the excuses. Patterns replaced randomness. The same names appeared at the center of conversations. The same voices were responded to immediately. His contributions no longer changed outcomes. They were acknowledged late or not at all, absorbed without comment, as if they had always belonged to someone else. He began replaying interactions, not to assign blame, but to locate the moment control had shifted. There was no single mistake, no misstep dramatic enough to explain the result. Instead, there were dozens of small accommodations, small acts of availability, small concessions offered in the name of ease. He had mistaken cooperation for stability. He had mistaken responsiveness for relevance. He noticed how expectations formed around his presence. If he replied quickly once, that speed became the standard. If he explained himself once, explanation became assumed. Silence from others was normal. Silence from him required justification. The imbalance grew quietly, supported by his own participation. Eventually, he stopped trying to interpret words and started watching behavior. Who received immediate responses even when they contributed nothing? Who could interrupt without consequence? Who spoke without monitoring reactions? Who arrived late without apology, and who felt compelled to explain every delay? He noticed that status did not announce itself through authority or volume. It expressed itself through timing, effort, and the absence of urgency. When he reduced his output, the silence around him expanded. Not aggressively, not as punishment, simply as a consequence. Messages remained unanswered longer. Conversations continued without pause. The urge to restore balance surfaced immediately. It felt physical, almost involuntary. He recognized it as conditioning, not intuition. He observed how people leaned toward those who seemed least invested, how eagerness repelled without ever being criticized, how neutrality unsettled others more than confrontation ever had. When he stopped filling gaps, others rushed to fill them instead. They offered extra information. They explained themselves unnecessarily. They laughed in places that didn't require humor. He let the pauses remain. Being ignored created space. In that space, patterns became visible. He saw how friendliness arrived precisely when something was needed and faded once it was obtained. How concern appeared selectively, never consistently. How availability was interpreted as obligation and absence as leverage. He noticed how warmth could be withdrawn without explanation, leaving the recipient searching for fault. He realized how often conversation functioned as negotiation rather than exchange. Statements were rarely meant to communicate. They were probes designed to test reactions. Agreement was recorded. Resistance was remembered. Silence disrupted these tests. Without immediate feedback, intent slipped through. People revealed themselves in the way they adjusted. He began responding less and noting more. The less he reacted, the more people revealed. Tone sharpened, impatience surfaced, some attempted humor, others applied pressure disguised as concern, a few withdrew entirely. Each response mapped a different need. He learned who required validation, who required control, and who required an audience more than honesty. Time passed without resolution. No one acknowledged the shift because acknowledgement would require accountability. The silence served everyone involved. It allowed others to feel dominant without confrontation. It allowed him to observe without exposure. The arrangement persisted because it demanded nothing from those willing to avoid discomfort. He noticed how rarely people asked direct questions. Most inquiries were framed indirectly, leaving room to retreat if the answer was inconvenient. Interest was conditional, curiosity calculated. When attention briefly returned, it came paired with expectation. He recognized the pattern immediately. He declined without explanation, not as a statement, but as a boundary that required no defense. He watched how absence altered perception. Those who valued consistency adjusted without prompting. Those who relied on access lost interest quickly. The silence separated attachment from convenience. He clarified who noticed absence and who only noticed availability. He no longer needed inclusion to understand position. He became aware of how often people equated responsiveness with worth, how silence was interpreted first as indifference, then as threat. Narratives formed quickly in the absence of reassurance. He allowed them to form. Correcting them would have required participation. Participation would have restored the old balance. Being ignored stopped feeling personal once the mechanism became clear. It wasn't about disapproval, it was about control. Attention functioned as a reward for predictability and compliance. Silence tested who would destabilize themselves trying to restore equilibrium. Those who reacted emotionally surrendered leverage without noticing. He observed the discomfort his withdrawal produced, not openly, quietly. Passive remarks surfaced, feigned concern appeared. Questions were framed to provoke explanation. He met none of it directly. The absence of resistance denied traction. Without engagement, there was nothing to escalate. He noticed how quickly people revealed intent when reassurance was removed. Without reaction, manipulation stalled. Without explanation, negotiation collapsed. Silence stripped interactions down to motive. It removed decoration. It exposed structure. He no longer sought inclusion to confirm relevance. He no longer mistook proximity for alignment. The pattern repeated often enough to remove doubt. Being ignored was not the absence of feeling, it was a tactic. And once recognized, it lost its ability to confuse. The quiet remained, not as punishment, not as victory, simply as a condition. Within it, clarity persisted. The silence remained, not as a weapon, but as a filter. It separated those who needed him from those who merely used him. In the end, he didn't lose his place in the world. He simply stopped fighting to keep a place that never existed.